So Longhorn 3210, he asks us, over the years, I've had the theory that Texas high school football players are often maxed out after high school because of the culture and terrific coaching in that state. I have mixed feelings because of draft results, but there are many examples that do support the theory. What do y'all think? I've certainly heard it. I'm sure Barton has too. That like these Texas guys are, if not maxed out, a little bit closer to their ceiling, perhaps, which I think is a little bit too much of a generalization. Although I think if you took like an average sampling of kids from Texas versus kids from Florida, I think there's probably some truth to the idea that Texas kids are a little bit close to being maxed out, simply because Texas high school programs have much nicer facilities. I mean, like you go to some of these basically wherever the opening or Under Armour camp is that year, and it's like, oh hey, here's a $12 million indoor facility that we also have literally on our campus. And in Florida, like you don't have programs that have indoor facilities. You don't have the nutrition and the multiple strength coaches on a high school football staff. So there are reasons to believe that maybe on average a Texas player might be a little more closer to his ceiling than a Florida player, simply because he's had more opportunities for development. Whereas, Florida, oftentimes these kids are really, really raw. And you recruit some kids from Florida, and it's like, hey, if I put 50 pounds on this kid, and the coach isn't joking. They're like, hey, I mean, it'll take me 2 years, but once he gets 3 meals a day and actually lifts some weights, he's going to be a beast. But we do see that sometimes in Texas too, man. Like, it's not like that never happens in Texas. I think the issue is one of frequency. How often do we see that happening in Texas? How often do we see that happening in Florida?
Do you remember? I just assume you followed this. I know you were in Florida, but I think you were pretty dialed in nationally. But I mean, when the Texas Mac Brown regime started going downhill,
oh yeah.
Do you remember like the way they recruited? That basically like February would come around, they'd have 2 big junior days, and they would fill their class. Like they'd take 20 commits in February for the following February. So before anyone's played a down of football, before anyone's played a down of spring football, Texas would basically have their class filled. And it was basically because they could. They could almost just get it out of the way.
It was like making your bet on the river after the turn card.
Yeah.
I was like, what are we doing?
And they pick because they could pick. I mean, they had first pick. And so they would pick first and pick early. And you are by definition at that point taking maxed out players. Like you're taking early developers. And so that kind of doomed Mac Brown, and it proved to come back and bite him. And so I still think that I mean, there's still guys that are overexposed, have been trained their whole life, 7-on-7 their whole life, all the stuff we talked about earlier. But I mean, as the commenter, Longhorn 3210, as he said, like, there's some skepticism to the idea that they're all maxed out because, like, I just looked at this year's draft. First 5 guys from Texas taken: Okuda, CeeDee Lamb, Caleb Von Chasen, Jalen Reagor, Kenneth Murray. All those guys were no doubt guys. Chasen certainly wasn't maxed out because his first year playing football was a junior year. But all those guys had offers from everybody else. But the next 6 taken were Jordan Brooks, Jeff Gladney, Robert Hunt, Ross Blacklock, Laviska Shenault, and Antoine Winfield. Other than Blacklock, none of those guys were highly rated. So they're still good players in Texas. The point I'm getting to is that sometimes the best players in Texas aren't the earliest developers. And so I think that –
Did any of those guys go to A&M or Texas? Any of those 12?
It was something like the first – I think it was like the first 17 or something didn't go – let me see. Well, I got it right here. First 11, 12, 13, 14. I think the first 14 or so guys did not go to Texas or A&M.
Let me ask you this. Do you think there's something to the idea that because high school football in Texas is so popular, like we have websites dedicated to high school football in Texas. We have magazines, like preseason magazines about Texas high school football. Do you think that like the celebrity level of these players at the high school, like at the high school level, is so much greater than it is in other states that it might cause their hype to be like within their own state, sort of out of control a little bit, and those schools focus in on those guys who are really stars at the high school level more so than perhaps projecting them as much as they should have been doing 4 or 5 years ago. Because the results would say that the teams with the top picks, Texas and A&M, in the draft, have not been projecting enough, and perhaps have been relying a little bit too much on guys who were just studs in high school.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Like if you've got a guy that's, you're building your board out after their sophomore years, and he's the top of your board, and it's just going to be just like in 24/7 sports rankings. Like the guys that we miss, I guarantee you that the guys that we miss on, I haven't done this study, but I guarantee the guys we miss on are the guys that ranked earliest, and the guys that we move up late are more rare that those guys are misses. And it's because it's a more reactive ranking. And so from the college perspective, I really think that you're going to get in trouble when you're fixated on the guy you've been watching since sophomore year instead of being willing to like identify. And look, you've been recruiting and building a relationship with them, and then you want to take them. And so I think that's a really tricky thing for colleges to navigate, is making sure that you're recruiting them early enough while also leaving the opportunity for other guys to grow in your subconscious or your consciousness.
There's also incentive there, right? If you're a college, there is an incentive to move on to the next class because you're getting the jump start. And I think that there is a breaking point where it does make sense to move on to the next class, devote your scouting resources to assuming that they're finite, devote your resources to the next class, start looking at the next class, get a jump start on that next class. I'd be interested to see if some schools can have an advantage simply by waiting back a lot and really focusing on late developers and being willing to punt maybe on some of these January, February junior days that some of these schools seem to have. I don't think anybody will do it, but if one team did it while the rest of the market focused on the next class, they might have an advantage. Just self-disclosure here from our standpoint, it makes a lot of financial sense as a business to start to look at the next class as well for us. But I think we did take a good job this year and really focus on those final ratings, perhaps more so, at least from my understanding, I haven't been here that long, than we did in prior years. Like we really took time to look at senior years more.
Shay Dixon and I were talking. Shay, we talked about this on the podcast, but Shay Dixon, who runs our LSU site, observed that LSU's last offer in the past, I don't know how many classes it was, 5 or something, and last take were, I want to say it's either the last take in the class and or the lowest rated player in the class, maybe both, has always been drafted. And I think that speaks to the late risers, and it's almost makes you wonder if, and I talked about this with Shay, like if you're a program like LSU and you have a state like that, Louisiana, and certainly Texas, the state of Texas would fall into this category as well. Georgia probably would, and the big ones probably would. But if you just sort of carve out and say, no matter what, we are going to leave 2, maybe 3 spots available in our class, and we're going to take the best senior risers in our state and or go try to recruit those guys. And because if you're a state that dominates if you are a program that dominates your state like LSU does Louisiana in recruiting, you kind of have the ability to do that. But you also often aren't going to have room for those guys when they rise up. There was a kid in the state of Louisiana this past year that Jonathan Horton was his name, who was his first year playing football as a senior. His film is ridiculous. It's absurd. And he commits to Virginia, and LSU probably didn't really have room for him. But that's the type of kid that, if LSU just sort of carves out a spot, or if Texas carves out a spot in the state of Texas, and, for those senior risers, like I bet pretty good chance a lot of those guys are going to hit. Obviously that's maybe easier to draw up in theory than it is in practice, but it's kind of an interesting, it kind of gets to, I think the point of the question originally is like the idea of, a lot of players are maxed out in a lot of states. It's just a matter of whether you're picking the right ones, because there's still a lot of guys getting developed out of the state of Texas that are really elite.